recognize most everyone here, but those of you who I don't recognize, thanks for coming out. It's great to see you. On behalf of Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, I'm Ryan Szymanski, and I get to introduce Mr. Paul Stillwell here. I would, before we get started, like to thank Paul and his wife for driving up here today to do this talk. And I would like to thank Naval Institute Press for sponsoring this talk. Now, apparently they didn't tell Paul, but they've already sold out 3 full printings of this book. And they've only done 1 printing so far. So if you haven't gotten one yet, we've got what's in the box here, and then they say they should have more in by early January. So, Paul Stillwell graduated from Drury College, Springfield, Missouri, in 1966 with a bachelor's degree in history, and in 1978 from the University of Missouri-Columbia with a master's in journalism. A Vietnam veteran, he served on board the tank landing ship Washoe County from 1966 until 1969. In 1969, as a lieutenant, Stillwell was the Assistant Combat Information Center officer on the Battleship New Jersey during operations in the Eastern Pacific. Stillwell retired as a commander in the Naval Reserves in 1992, following 30 years of service. His final active duty was in 1988, when he was sent to the Persian Gulf as a historian to document the Navy's role in Operation Earnest Will during the Iran-Iraq War. Stillwell was on the staff of the Naval Institute from 1974 to 2004, and continues to do freelance history work. During his time on the staff, he served several editorial roles with Proceedings, was editor of the annual Naval Review, was the founding editor-in-chief of Naval History magazine, and served as director of oral history and the history division. For 23 years, he wrote a column titled Looking Back for Naval History. All told, he is the author or co-author or editor of 13 books, including Battleship New Jersey, An Illustrated History, and Battleship Commander, the first biography of Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee. So, please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Stillwell.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that welcome. It's always wonderful, except as he mentioned, I've been a magazine editor, and I must tell you that some of us who came from the state of Missouri pronounce it that way. My brother, who lives in the state of Missouri, pronounces it Missouri, as did Harry Truman, so go figure. Thank you all for turning out. I have to say that this ship, serving in this ship, was the most enjoyable experience of my life. I mean, as far as jobs, and I've had some good jobs too, but just being on board BB-62 was a genuine thrill. We'd go into a port and literally bands were playing, people were on the pier watching us come in. One day in Alameda, California, we had Visitors Day, and people, I think we had about 11 or 12,000 people wait in line for hours to come on the afterbrow, walk forward on the deck, and leave by the forward brow. And we could pinch ourselves, and we can be here every day. Of course, that did come to an untimely end. Summer of 1969, we were all set to deploy to Vietnam. We did the gunfire trials, shot at San Clemente Island off Southern California, went out to Hawaii on a midshipman cruise. Oh, I must tell you, we stopped in Tacoma, Washington on the way. And I had a job called beach guard. And I was on the Battleship Sailor 2. Sadly, I didn't have that opportunity. I think it was August we got the word that the ship would be, instead of going to Vietnam, would be going to Bremerton, Washington to be decommissioned. And I remember my boss, who was the CIC officer, wrote on his desk pad, "Bad day at Black Rock." We had a wonderful skipper during the first time I was on board, Captain Ed Snyder. Had a long heritage. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1944. He was on board the Battleship Pennsylvania in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of that year. And I want to mention as an aside that one of his shipmates on board Pennsylvania was Johnny Carson. Yes, that Johnny Carson. And from time to time, I would watch The Tonight Show, and Johnny would talk about the old Pennsylvania, and you could tell there was a warm feeling. And a warm feeling is what I definitely had on board this ship. As I mentioned, she was going to be decommissioned. We were in Bremerton for about a month when I got orders to leave. And when a ship is being mothballed and not at sea, there is really no role for the assistant CIC officer. It was just make work type of stuff. So the detailer said, well, you got two choices at this point. You can sign up for another 2 years at sea, or you can go home. I took window number 2, went home to Missouri. Soon after I got there, I got a letter from a friend in Minneapolis. Fate does strange things. There was a bus strike in Minneapolis that fall, and so he started giving his neighbor rides to work at the University of Minnesota. He was a graduate student. She ran the journalism library. And they got to know each other. So he sent me a letter, had a picture of her, and said, well, you might want to meet her. So here I am at home, waiting to go to school in journalism. So I went 600 miles for a blind date in the dead of winter. Met her on the 30th of December, 1969, just before the end of the decade. We've been married 51 years, and she's the lady with the blonde hair. There was another lasting impact of the way the ship changed my life. I went to journalism school, University of Missouri, and the idea was that I was going to become a sports writer. And I had nurtured this goal, this hope, since I was in high school. And worked on the newspaper in Columbia, Missouri, covered sports. Met the sports editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he said, I'd like to hire you for my staff, but we've just hired some new people recently. We'll stay in the area and keep in touch, and we'll let you know. So he recommended me to be the assistant PR man for the St. Louis Cardinals. Well, that's my favorite team, and it's like a dream job. The only drawback was that there was virtually no salary. It was about $7,000 a year if I had stayed the year. But I got told to finish that job in about May of that year because the players had gone on strike. And Anheuser-Busch, with all its millions, wanted to say to the players, you know, this has hurt the team too. We had to let somebody go. So then I went across the hall in Busch Stadium and worked for the football Cardinals for 2 years. And the owner, Bill Bidwell, had the reputation as the most miserly owner in the NFL. So I went to him about Thanksgiving. I said, I've been here 2 seasons, I've had more responsibility this year, and so I'd like to get a raise. He said, well, we do raises in February, but we'll give you a Christmas bonus. 3rd of January, he said, his henchman said, well, you're no longer needed here. They could leave the job open for 6 months during the off season. and hire some new person for the same salary he'd been paying me. At that point, I thought maybe this sports writer thing is not working out that well. Well, as a result of a thesis I wrote at the University of Missouri, I had gotten in touch with a Navy captain who lived in St. Louis. He subsequently moved to Annapolis, and Karen and I had visited Annapolis a couple years earlier and really liked the community. So I just sent him a handful of resumes, and one of them wound up at the Naval Institute when there was an opening, and that's almost 50 years ago. So it turns out that the skills needed in naval history are very similar to those in journalism: research, writing, interviewing. And so it turned out to be a good fit, something I had never dreamed of doing, but which I have enjoyed almost as much as serving on board this ship. There are so many memories. I think of the times that we went out to Hawaii. We were there for about 10 days, and I was telling Karen, there's a little anteroom just behind us. And on the 20th of July, 1969, we watched on the television in that room as Neil Armstrong set the first step on the moon. Had liberty that afternoon, went to Waikiki Beach. And well, I must say that on board this ship, we saw the lunar module land. On the lifeguards TV at Waikiki, saw this first step. And I had to pinch myself. They are paying me for this. Unfortunately, down in CIC, we didn't get to see too much. I mean, we're looking at radar scopes. We've got all these guys topside. They say, oh, isn't this magnificent? There's the Golden Gate Bridge. There's Waikiki. There's the Diamond Head. Had to take their word for it, but when we got outside, we saw that those predictions were true. I remember the camaraderie with the radarmen, as they were then called. There were about 50 of them in the radar division, and maybe about half a dozen of those were qualified in electronic countermeasures. That was the spook shack at the forward end of the CIC, which was on the fourth deck. And you had to go, the ladder down to CIC was just forward of here. You can see the 4-inch thick armored deck. It had the belt armor, 12 inches or more on the sides. And I thought, well, we're pretty safe in here. And I remember one night we were steaming north, going up to somewhere for an exercise, probably to the San Francisco area. And the seas were rough. And we got radio messages from destroyers accompanying us and said, gee, can you slow down? This is really beating us up. We've had lights broken by the seas. We've had windows broken. And we were just plowing right through it. And I had the feeling like this is almost like being in a room ashore, because you could feel no movement. So we depended on what we heard from those outside. And those radarmen were just crackerjack. I was sort of in charge of the care and feeding of them, dealing with personal issues or what have you. But I learned so much from them. The main battery plotting room was right adjacent. There was a hatch, a watertight door between us and the plotting room. And the beautiful coordination between the fire controlman and the radarman, making sure we were on target, and then sending those 16-inch projectiles flying out. Ironically, I never got to see a 16-inch gun fired during my entire tour on board. Yes, sir.
Did you feel it go?
feel it.
Vibration, anything?
I don't remember. I remember there was a kind of a dull noise, but
No?
nothing, yeah, it's a thump, nothing spectacular. So I was very fortunate to come back in 1983 after the ship had been recommissioned and spent 2 weeks at sea gathering material for the book I subsequently wrote about the New Jersey. And then I wasn't tied down. I went up all the way to the top to the 011 level. And when they fired, oh my gosh, you've heard the word awesome, and it is frequently misused. It is frequently an exaggeration, but not in this case. It was stunning. And this, mind you, was one gun at a time, nothing like a 9-gun salvo. But there were so many sensations coming all at once. The heat, the light, the noise, and the shock wave. You knew you'd been on something real. And must be 1330.
Indeed.
I remember the sound of the ship's bells during our waking times. I remember sitting at those tables during meal times, and before evening chow, they had kind of a guy playing a little xylophone or some kind of musical note to call us to dinner. Breakfast was kind of catch as catch can because the watches were changing. Same with lunch, it was kind of pickups, but evening meal was special. The really senior guys, the exec, the department head sat at this table behind me. The rest of us sat at these tables. All the way in the back were the warrant officers. And you sat in order of rank and seniority. We had napkin rings with our job title on them. And you were always sitting with the same guys because the seniority didn't change. Till I made lieutenant, then I think I moved up a few places. But the evening meals were spectacular. I just read a book called The Twilight of the Gods by Ian Toll about the last 2 years of World War II in the Pacific. And you got a feel for what it was like to be on board ship. And he said at Sunday, or some dinners, they would serve baked Alaska. And that was our typical Sunday night dinner. Such a special treat. And we had smaller waistlines then, so we could afford that intake. But the camaraderie was so special. The Navy has a prized term called shipmate. It means you have served together, you've gone through the same pleasures, the same experiences, the same hardships, whatever they are. And a destroyer man put it very well when he said, friends may come and go, but shipmates are forever. And I have been to reunions for both New Jersey and the LST that was over in Vietnam. And the years just fall away. We no longer talk about rank, it's just first names, and such a special feeling. I am getting goosebumps just thinking about that. And that goes back to being part of a team. Captain Ed Snyder was not out of the mold of strictly by the book. He was the skipper when I reported. And he would roam the ship. He might show up down in the bakery at 2 a.m. and talk to the guys who were making the bread and rolls for the next day's chow. He'd go down to the engine room. He trusted his officers of the deck on board ship, on board the bridge, to get the ship where she needed to go and when. And Ryan was saying he has never heard anybody say a bad word about Ed Snyder. There's another Navy saying that loyalty down produces loyalty up, and he had that in the palm of his hand. He did not let down on professional standards. He expected the ship to be clean. He expected her to shoot well. But he was a human being and did not treat the crew as if they were some kind of serfs or vassals. They were fellow human beings. They were shipmates. They would have birthday cakes, special birthday cakes. Made sure that they got recognized. Now let me transition from here to Willis Lee, and you may wonder what the connection is. We had an operations office up on the O2 level, port side, and one day I saw a World War II cruise ship for New Jersey. It was called Warlog. It's just fascinating to see these pictures of the shipmates from 25 years earlier. And on one page were 4 portrait photos of the 4 admirals who had been on board New Jersey and flown their flags. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who was commander 5th Fleet. Rear Admiral Willis Lee, who was commander Battleship Division 6, came aboard in May 44. Admiral William Halsey, commander 3rd Fleet, 4 stars. And the 4th was Rear Admiral Oscar Badger, who had the ship near the end of the war. And I thought, that's kind of remarkable, only 4 admirals. And that piqued my interest in Willis Lee because I had heard nothing about him. So one thing led to another, as so often happens in life, just as the sports writer failure led to the naval historian. So that cruise book led me to research Willis Lee. And it started in 1975 when I did the first research. And the book just came out last month. And people have asked the obvious question, what took you so long? And I said, well, there were a few other things came in between, some other books, lots of oral histories, magazine editing. And the time just didn't seem quite right. Well, in 2020, the time was right. I had always told myself I will do more research. That is the eternal curse of somebody who's writing a book. I don't know enough yet. Well, Mr. COVID reared his ugly head, and his message, it didn't go out around the world, but it came to me, was, Paul, get the book done. You can't do any more research. You can't travel. Write the book. So I did. And Admiral Lee was such a fascinating character. In the 70s, I had gone back to his hometown in Owenton, Kentucky, and some of the old timers there had known him when he was a youth. They said he had a built-in shooting arm and apparently an unlimited supply of ammunition. He shot out weather vanes, squirrels, birds. One time he shot out the window of a neighbor. The glass poured in on the neighbor girl's dollhouse. Fortunately, she wasn't injured. But we hear this term obsessive compulsive, and I admit to some tendencies in that direction. Well, Lee was well beyond that with shooting. He was also mischievous. There's a chapter called Mischievous Moes in Kentucky. He was up to pranks. He went to school one day, and he had a sack of Bull Durham tobacco in his shirt pocket, had the tag dangling out so that the teacher could see it. Teacher took the bag out, threw it in the stove. No more tobacco that day. So then this mischievous person, who had a great deal of imagination, went home, took the gunpowder out of some shotgun shells, put it into a Bull Durham bag, went to school, tag hanging down, of course, so the teacher would see it. Teacher took the bag, threw it into the stove, which proceeded to explode. And Lee could say with a straight face, though he probably didn't have a straight face, "I didn't do it. The teacher did it. You all saw it." One time, he and a friend had some squares of candy, and their friends were asking for them. And so he and his buddy went and took the candies out and cut up bars of soap and put square pieces in the candy wrappers. And then after that, they were willing to share them. He would come to school sometimes with small animals in his pocket. I read a letter from one of his classmates who said, well, nobody wanted to sit at the desk with him because you never knew what kind of a forest creature would come crawling out. I talked to an old woman named Florence Dubbs. I mean, she probably was in her 80s. That seems old now, not so much now, but she said one time we got a horse, killed some snakes and tied them to the horse's tail. She was an expert rider. And so she ran through the town of Owenton, Kentucky, and the kids, Lee among them, were shouting, "Oh no, the horses run away, the snake's after her, God knows what's gonna happen." Well, she wrote me a letter after that, or maybe it was when I was talking to her, and she said, well, all of us got a good tongue lashing after that, but I believe it did not do any of us any good. He got an appointment to the Naval Academy in Annapolis when he was 16 years old, hadn't even finished high school. He was a very bright individual. He could do all sorts of trigonometry functions in his head, carry out the pi ratio to however many decimals you wanted. But the people in Owenton had heard about the stern discipline. And one woman wrote, the only thing that surprised us was that he actually made it through, because knowing what a prankster he was, they thought he wouldn't adjust. He didn't really get into his studies there. He had two main interests: firing pistols or rifles and drawing cartoons. And I've seen some wonderful self-portraits he did. But he was on the rifle team. While he was in Kentucky, he and a friend had set up a bomb. They had a trail of gunpowder leading to a tin can. They lit it off, and the idea was that would be the fuse. It didn't go off. So they got close, and then it did go off. And Lee was hit in the face. Fortunately, the doctor was able to prevent any scarring, but his vision was forever damaged after that. He wore thick glasses throughout his naval career. He was almost blind when he had no glasses. But his classmates would help him. After he had failed the test, which he was bound to do, they would tell him the sequence of letters that were in certain lines on the eye chart. He had a great memory, so he'd go in on the retest and just reel them off. So he got commissioned with a waiver to be retested, and it took into World War I before the Navy finally decided, this guy can do a good job, we'll let him stay. But even with that poor vision, in the year 1907, he went to Camp Perry in Ohio on the shore of Lake Erie for the national rifle and pistol matches. By 1 point, he won the pistol championship. As he said later, he didn't know what else to do, so he went and took the rifle, took part in that tournament and won that as well. The only person ever to win them in the same year, let alone the same day. And for the years afterward, Lee would be the coach of the Navy rifle team. And then in 1920, he went over to the Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium, and won 7 gold medals as part of team competition, not individual shooting, but team. There's a wonderful photo taken in 1920 that shows him with the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, and the captain of the rifle team. And Lee's got 7 medals in front of him, and the captain has 1. After he was commissioned, he served in an old battleship, Idaho, later went over to China. When he was at the Naval Academy, he got the nickname of Chink. Not politically correct, but some of his classmates thought that he had kind of a Oriental appearance, now to use that non-PC word. And he was interested in China. So one time on a midshipman cruise, they went into a port and they saw Hua Li's Chinese Laundry. Well, one of his nicknames was Hua, W-A-H, because his first 2 initials were W-A. So he went to the laundryman and copied down his signature in a Chinese character. And in his page in the yearbook, he signed it with his American name and with the Chinese character that represented Hua Li. Later, it got changed a bit to Ching Li, by which he's more commonly known since then. I guess that's slightly more PC, but not a whole lot. But he got over to China, and he was offered a bonus to take part in the Chinese Civil War. And the people in charge of this expedition said he would be paid handsomely, and they would give him the additional privilege of being able to chop off as many Chinese heads as he wanted. He politely declined that honor. He did set up to go tiger hunting in Indochina, near what's now Vietnam, and he was willing to shoot at apparently anything. One time the Americans were in Hong Kong and were going to shoot against the British, and he deliberately did poorly. So the next time came up these matches, and the British said, well, we'll take him. Apparently they hadn't heard about the Olympics. Boom, bullseye, bullseye, bullseye. So money was bet on that. In the meantime, in 1914, he was in the crew as an ensign, the Battleship New Hampshire. It's long forgotten now, but there was a Veracruz incident in 1914 when some sailors were arrested when they went ashore in Tampico. And the commander of the battleship division demanded an apology, the release of the seamen, and a gun salute. The Mexicans let them go, gave the apology, but they were not about to fire his gun salute. So the U.S. ships, the Navy ships, sent a landing party ashore. Lee, at that point, it would be both sailors and Marines armed with rifles. And sometimes the Mexicans would be hidden as snipers. And Lee would sit out in the open with the rifle across his knees, just daring them to shoot at him. And as soon as the Mexican showed enough of himself, Lee would shoot him. So the guy dropped to the road much below. And one of the crew members then was a seaman named Arthur Sweetman. I knew his son Jack, who was a professor at Naval Academy, and he wrote a book about the Veracruz incident. And he said, Willis Lee participated in several shooting matches. There were no return engagements. He shot, no more but somebody to fire back. He was in destroyers during the 20s, and he was just a natural for that. Went over to the China station, and he had a good sense of humor. It just came through in so many aspects. The ship went into Yokohama Harbor after the earthquake, 1923, and he had the carpenter's mate put a chopping block up on one of the gun mounts and put some canvas around it, paint it gray so that the Japanese would think it was some new secret weapon. They were clicking their cameras to get that. He enjoyed that duty. I talked to a man who was in the same destroyer division, and Lee was so imaginative on shooting at things. They had these angle irons in the wardroom, and there apparently was some distance that rats and mice could run along them. So Lee rigged up a BB gun, and people would time it so that they could fire and hit the rats. And it took them a little while to get the timing right. Later, it got even more sophisticated. They set up a guillotine on the angle iron, had a razor sharp blade, and it was connected to an electric solenoid. And you had to push the button at just the right moment because there was some lag time between the button push and the guillotine. But after a while, they got the hang of it, and as one of the shipmates said, we sent a lot of rats to Rat Valhalla. In the late 20s, he was commander of the destroyer Lardner. She was based in Charleston, South Carolina. His wife joined him there, and she said, we saw some interesting trees. We saw the trees with the hanging Spanish moss and what have you. And we learned that the word here is actually 2 syllables, here. He delighted in ship handling. He was so good at it. He once took a challenge that he could bring his destroyer right up against the stern of a destroyer ahead. And people said, you cannot do that. The prop wash will push you to one side or the other. But Lee did. He brought his ship just to the stern and just kissed that stern. And this is something that stuck in the memory of a man I interviewed 50 years later. Lee was a memorable individual. Around 1930, he was captain at the U.S. rifle matches at Camp Perry, Ohio. And well, there were also in the 20s, there was one time, this is during Prohibition, mind you, and the guys went out and shot, and one of the members of the team had told Commander Lee at that point, well, my fiance are going to get married, and then we'll join you for the shooting. And Commander Lee politely said, well, that's fine. If you want to do that now, you won't be on the team. And as the man wrote years later, we deferred the wedding for a few months, and we've had a happy relationship ever since. Around 1930, they had some more matches, and Lee had set up a tent for his Navy team. And as each pair of shooters came back, he would open up a suitcase that was full of Canadian Club whiskey during Prohibition, and said, man, you just need a little something to take the edge off. And so 2 by 2, they came in. And that was part of Lee's way of taking care of those who served under him and why they loved him so much. He later went on to Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island, learned about strategy and tactics. They studied the 1916 British-German Battle of Jutland till they had the thing memorized. Things were much different by the time World War II came along, but that's what they had to work on in the meantime. And it was to teach them how to do a war game and what it looks like as you go through with the rolls of the dice. Then he became executive officer of the Battleship Pennsylvania, which was the fleet flagship. So much spit and polish on board the flagship. And he was in charge of navigation. Then he moved up to be executive officer. And that's the chief disciplinarian in the ship. That's the guy who's responsible for making everything look good. They had bits along the deck. I'm sure you've seen them. Wind the mooring lines around them when they come on board the ship. And they had brass plates on them that had to be shined every day to keep up that image. In the area of discipline, I talked to a man named Richard Steer, who had been an Olympic swordsman in 1932. And he was an ensign on board. And he forgot to show up for a watch New Year's Day. He'd been celebrating a little too much. He had to go see Commander Lee to get his punishment. And Lee waved a hand at him and said, well, just don't do it again. He was very forgiving in that way, and there are numerous examples of that. And I talked to Captain Steer, who also was probably in his 80s by then, and he said, I imagine I suffered more anticipating what would happen than what actually happened. So I had punished myself, so Lee didn't need to. He moved on to serve in Fleet Training Division in Naval Operations in the old Navy Department in Washington. They were involved with keeping track of the annual competitions in engineering, gunnery, what have you. And that was the way you practice for war, is by doing things that are useful in war. They had fleet problems, which were battle exercises. And one of the men who served with him there in the mid-30s, Lieutenant Commander Red Shuffle, and he had a cubicle next to Lee's. This is the predecessor of the cubicle era. But one day he heard this noise. He said it was like a flit-flang or something like that. And he felt something going past him. And then he heard some chuckles from Lee's cubicle. And he went to investigate. And Lee had set up some birds on the back of a chair. And he was using a rubber band gun to shoot BBs at these things. So that's what his shipmate heard. But it's an example of Lee's imagination, his gimmickry, and always his willingness to shoot. When he'd be on board ship, they'd announce it's shooting time, and he would be joined on the fantail. Two men at the stern would throw up 2 tin cans simultaneously, and the report was that seldom ever did they hit the water unpunctured. And the guys who joined him on the fantail were generally the Marines, because that's their specialty. He went back to sea in 1936 as commanding officer of the old cruiser Concord. And she did well in so many competitions. They went on a battle problem that took them up to the Aleutian Islands, Dutch Harbor, and they needed fuel. And so they had to go alongside the Battleship New Mexico. And Lee's assistant engineer was a guy named Angus Sinclair, and they tried to use as little fuel as possible, because that would help them in the engineering standings. Well, his counterpart in USS New Mexico was a man named Lieutenant Hyman Rickover. You've probably heard of him, father of the nuclear navy. And if anything, Rickover was even stingier than Sinclair. So they had 2 hoses goosenecked over the lifelines. And the word didn't get over to New Mexico that they were going to take oil in Concord only from the after hose. Somebody down below didn't get the word. There's always that excuse in the Navy. We didn't get the word. There's always that percentage. So the oil came up in this hose, blew the plug out, and oil is flooding onto the deck of the Concord. So Lee's guys went out there with buckets and squeegees and whatever they could, because that oil didn't go through a meter and that wouldn't count. Rickover found out about it, and he had his guys go out with buckets and squeegees and whatever. The men of the Concord loved him. He fostered athletic teams, and the Concord did very well. They had raceboat crews for the Battenberg Cup. These are the ones where you pull the oars. It's like an old whaleboat, except the motive power is by those doing the rowing. Concord won the championship for Cruisers Battle Force, and then she won the championship for the entire U.S. fleet. This was unheard of for a light cruiser to do that. And because Lee created an atmosphere that this is important, and shipmate support shipmate. If somebody has to stand somebody else's watch to make that happen, they would do so eagerly. And one man said they would stand in line and beg for the opportunity to get out there and row their hands raw. Admiral, 1400. Admiral Harold Stark was the admiral on board. He was commander of Cruisers Battle Force. And there was a new movie out at that time called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Admiral Stark had white hair. He had 7 staff members. So then Ensign on board drew a cartoon that showed the admiral and the dwarfs doing their various things. In 1938, there was a ritzy dinner in New York, and the brother of one of the staff members had gone to the toy company, FAO Schwartz, and created china figurines of each of the 7 dwarfs and one of Snow White. And then at this banquet, each man got the figurine for his character. And perhaps not surprisingly, Lee's dwarf was called Happy. Then a new skipper came on board and the morale went down. And he was on board for a while because the new skipper, there was only one bridge, so he had to be there. And somebody said it must have pained Lee to see somebody else doing a job that he had done better and knew that he could do better. So finally they went down to the Caribbean, and the new Brooklyn class cruisers were coming in. And a number of his classmates were skippers of these new ships, which were much more modern than the Concorde. And one of them was the Captain Ike Giffen. And Lee had complained during a meeting that they were on the Honolulu, and the ship's store had no Bull Durham tobacco. So Giffen sent over a boat with a dozen packages of Bull Durham tobacco, because Lee smoked constantly, habitually, chain smoke, one from another. And Lee sent back a message, "Thanks for the services of your bull." Went on to Washington, 3 years there, preparing the fleet for war, getting as many anti-aircraft guns on ships as possible because they knew the threat was coming, get as many radars on board. And Lee, with his academic brilliance, understood the theories, but even more important, he was very pragmatic, and he knew how to make these things work in the fleet. It was so new that it was not general knowledge. In the summer of 1942, he got his chance to go to sea. His predecessor of Commander Battleship Division 6 was a man named John Wilcox, who had taken the flagship Washington over to serve with the British fleet. And on the way over, he was lost overboard. So there was no telling whether it was a wave, somebody pushed him because he was not popular, or he had killed himself because he was apprehensive about facing the Germans. But in any event, the job was open and Lee was sent to the Washington in August of 42. He was a workaholic. He had been able to spend very little time with his wife, even when they lived in the same apartment in Washington, because he was consumed by this job, obsessive compulsive. And he would frequently stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning, fortified by coffee and cigarettes. And as someone remarked, if you saw him at the Navy Department and it looked as if he had slept in his clothes, he probably had. So he got to go to sea. The Washington went to Tonga Taboo in the Friendly Islands. The South Dakota ran over a coral pinnacle on the way out of port, tore a hole in the bottom. So he had to switch to the Washington. That became his favorite flagship during the war, because he devised an impromptu CIC up on the flag level, get a radar scope in there, and phone talkers to pass image messages to the bridge. And there was a new type of radars, Sugar George, a surface search radar, that presented a circular picture, and the cursor would go around and you'd see blips where the other ships were. And this was almost like magic. It is as if God were over the ship and telling the ship where all the others are. And he was consumed by that. He would sit there for hours looking at the radar scope. And one man who was with him said he remembered a time when Lee was there. He didn't get much sleep at night. He fell asleep over the radar scope. And someone gently removed the cigarette from his fingers before it could burn down to his hand. November 1942, Battle of Guadalcanal. The Japanese were running Tokyo Express runs in to bombard the island at night to try to land troops. It was highly contested. A number of the bombardments were just terrible. People said it sounded like a freight train coming in at high speed. They'd go get in slit trenches. Well, on the night of the 12th and 13th, the cruiser force got shut up. A few of the ships were sunk. 2 nights later, Lee took his force in, Task Force 64. And this was not the kind of narrow waters in which battleships were intended, but it was so desperate, that's all they had. He had the Washington in the lead, the South Dakota was behind, 4 destroyers up ahead. They had never worked together, no common commander. They just happened to be the 4 destroyers in New Caledonia that had the most fuel on board. Turned out that was a moot point, because when they encountered the Japanese that terrible night, 3 of the 4 destroyers were sunk by torpedoes and gunfire, and the 4th had to rescue ones from the 3rd. In a sense, sadly, they were the sacrificial bait that drew the attention of the Japanese. At midnight, as November 15th began, Lee gave the order. We had already given the order to fire the cruisers, but this time to fire at the battleship Hiroshima. In his action report, he estimated that they probably made 8 hits on the Hiroshima. Somebody has subsequently done more research and concluded it was probably about 20. They were at almost point blank range, 8,000 yards. The higher you raise the gun barrels up to 45 degrees maximum, the farther the projectile will go. New Jersey could shoot them up to about 5 miles, 35,000 yards. And, but the guns were flat for that battle because they were so close, they needed no elevation for range. the South Dakota was pulverized because it came to a key point. The officer of the deck saw those burning destroyers, turned the Washington to port. The South Dakota had lost electrical power. She went to starboard and she was silhouetted by those burning destroyers. The Japanese had a target. Boom, boom, boom. Somebody went out the next morning and there was a hatch combing and there were half moons out of it, 14 inches in diameter, flat trajectory. That's how close they were. The superstructure was riddled with gunfire. And a number of men were killed, a number were maimed. I was telling Karen on the way up, one man a few years later had a visit from a man who'd been a seaman on board the South Dakota. And he was having terrible mental problems, what we now call PTSD. In the night, he'd had terrible nightmares, and sometimes he'd have his hands around his wife's throat. So Backus, Lieutenant J.G. Backus, was able to get him to the Philadelphia Naval Hospital, treated with hypnosis, and the nightmares went away. He was one of the lucky ones. These men were feeling in the dark because they couldn't turn on a light while the enemy was near. They're putting their hands on bodies and parts of bodies. As it happened, the Washington was really the only ship that did much damage. The South Dakota was blinded, she couldn't shoot. And that battle turned the tide. It was like a crossroad on the way to Tokyo. And after that night, the Japanese had one more Tokyo run, the Battle of Tassaronga, but they ceased their efforts to reinforce Guadalcanal and began withdrawing them. I talked to one of the men who'd been an ensign in Lee's staff, and he said, you can't get it from most of the writings, but we were in a truly desperate situation, and we did not know for a while after the battle whether we had won or lost. The South Dakota was badly damaged. The destroyers were out of it. So the Washington sailed back. They had an idle period through much of 1943. In early 44, they had the Marshall Islands landings, the Marianas in June. And in the meantime, while preparing for the Marianas, Lee was on board this ship temporarily because his regular flagship, Washington, had been damaged in a collision. So he'd gone back to a shipyard. And he was glad when Washington came back, but he stayed long enough to pose for that picture I saw. There's been criticism of Lee and the Marianas that he was given an opportunity to go to the west and chase the Japanese fleet. He declined because he said his men had not had enough, his captains hadn't had enough experience training together, operating together, because they had been in carrier screens to provide anti-aircraft fire instead of shooting their big guns and maneuvering with each other. After the summer, the Japanese came out again. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944, perhaps the biggest battle in naval history. This ship was the flagship. Admiral Halsey was in the flag quarters. And the Japanese were very clever. They sent down a decoy force of carriers from the north of the Philippines. And Halsey took the bait. And instead of leaving Lee behind to deal with the Japanese battleships coming through San Bernardino Strait on the east side of the Philippines, they were unguarded and they shot up aircraft carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, And Lee had sent 2 messages to Halsey's flagship pointing out that the Japanese were coming through. And I talked to one of his staff members who said he had to take a message to Lee because Commander 7th Fleet, for whom these little ships worked, was pleading, send Lee to San Bernardino Strait. Send the BBs. Where is Lee? Send Lee. Well, the battleships were steaming north, and then came a message from Admiral Nimitz that said, where is Task Force 34? This was what Lee's ships were designated. And then at the bottom it said, the world wonders. And that was supposed to be nonsense padding. But Halsey took it as a personal insult, figured he better turn the ships around. He had, one of his staff members said they moved out from the carrier screens. They were in battleships were a line abreast, ready to go against the Japanese ships to the north. And then Halsey sent them south. By the time the battleships got to San Bernardino Strait, the Japanese had already gone back home or headed there. And his classmate, Naval Academy classmate Thomas Kincaid said, I can well imagine my classmates' feelings. He steamed 300 miles north, 300 miles south, and never fired a shot. The man who brought him this message said when he brought one of these pleas to Lee, Lee sort of shrugged his shoulders. Maybe a tear came down his cheek, and he said, there's nothing I can do about it. Scholars have examined that and wondered what would have happened if the ultimate U.S. battleship, Iowa class, had faced the Yamato. And they concluded that the American ships had superior fire control. They could send those 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectiles over the horizon and guided precisely with fire control radar. Yamato was sunk by aircraft in the spring of 1945. Japanese no longer constituted a threat, the surface ships. So Lee was sent back to Casco Bay, Maine, and he was to do anti-kamikaze research, preparing for the projected invasion of Japan in the fall of '45. And he went most reluctantly. I have seen letters that Lee's wife wrote to her sisters back in Illinois, where she had spent the bulk of the war while he was overseas. And she said, Lee is eager to move. He's disappointed. He thinks if he doesn't get back to his battleships, they're his toys and somebody might break them. And he never got back. The surrender, the cessation of hostilities was on the 15th of August, 1945. He was living in a rooming house with his aide, his wife, and the aide's wife. And there came word of the surrender by the Japanese. And everybody seemed happy, except those 4 who were in that house. Lee was disconsolate because the war to which he had contributed so much had ended without him on board his battleships. His aide had enough points to be able to demobilize and return home. He was a reserve officer. On the 25th of August, he and his wife were due to head south. The Lees promised to make breakfast for them. I should say at an earlier occasion, the aide's wife was hosting the Lees for dinner. She didn't know that she was supposed to take the giblets outside of the bird she bought. She said the smell was something horrendous. So I asked my husband, what brand does he drink? What's his favorite cigarette? So she bought a carton of Palmolive, Pall Mall cigarettes. And when Yade's wife, she sort of shoved him into the most comfortable chair, said, "Admiral, will you have a Palmolive?" And Lee looked at his hands, and he turned to his wife and he said, "Do you think I need some soap?" And that broke the ice. They were all laughing. Well, on this last night, Lee was disconsolate. Then he had to go back to his office on Great Diamond Island in Casco Bay without Ertz in the aid since 1942. He was almost a surrogate son. The Lees had no children, and he was the right age. He got into his Admiral's barge to go out to his office. He started choking. 15 seconds, he was dead, and a massive heart attack. 57 years old. And he had a genetic predisposition. Both of his parents had died of heart attacks. Constant smoker, no exercise on board ship. The stress of getting up in the middle of the night to respond to messages, action messages. Now that the pressure was off, he died. It's irony. This man from Kentucky died in Maine, the land of the Yankees. This men of big ships died in a boat. This splendid warrior died with the coming of peace. And he left a wonderful legacy that we now celebrate. The men who served under him went on to do important things in the Navy. He eschewed publicity, didn't want to talk to news correspondents, obviously didn't get to write a memoir. So I was able to write that story for him. And I thank you for coming. Any questions? You're good for questions.
Sometimes.
Yes, sir.
Could you speak somewhat to his ability to cut the Bureau of Ordnance bureaucracy with getting the surface and air surface radars out to the ships?
He did all he could. Lee hated paperwork. Unfortunately, he had a chief of staff named Bill Jennings, who had a law degree, so he ate this stuff up. And he would take care of the paperwork. Lee would bombard the Bureau of Ordnance with suggestions. I haven't mentioned the proximity fuse. This was a 5-inch anti-aircraft round that had a tiny radar in it. If it got near a Japanese plane, that would send back a signal and that would explode the fuse. So you didn't have to hit the plane, just get near it. And he really championed getting those rounds out to the fleet. And the man who worked with him was James Van Allen, later an astrophysicist. He discovered the Van Allen radiation belts after the satellites went up. And he said Lee was the most interesting character he met in all his naval service. Anybody else? Carol? Oh, me.
I got one for the internet here. We have a what if. Do you think the Japanese would have won the entire Guadalcanal campaign if Hiroshima hadn't taken out Henderson instead of being taken out by Washington? Does that make sense?
It's possible, but I would guess not likely, because the Japanese had taken a lot of casualties. The Marines had been reinforced, and they had lost their first 2 battleships of the war 2 nights apart. So in a way, they're sending their ships and men into a meat chopper. And I guess if the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto had a crystal ball, he would have sent more ships in, but they had troubles with fuel shortages. And that was the reason they attacked Pearl Harbor in the first place. They wanted to get the US fleet off to the side so it would not interfere with their activities going into the Dutch East Indies and so forth to get supplies of oil for the war machine. And in some cases, they were burning unrefined oil, which was hard on the boilers. But they didn't have a lot to spare. When they sent the Yamato out in 1945, she had only enough fuel for a one-way trip, so that was a suicide mission. Had Yamamoto known that this was the pivotal point, maybe he would have done more, but we'll never know.
I've heard it said that an admiral's staff reflects their personality. Halsey had a huge staff, which all had big personalities themselves, while Spruance had a much smaller staff. What can you say about Lee's staff?
Well, at the beginning, he got on board South Dakota here at Philadelphia and came aboard by himself because Admiral Wilcox's staff had departed for wherever they went. And he asked his friend Bill Jennings to go to the Bureau of Personnel and find an officer who was well qualified in fire control, because that was the important thing to Lee. And so this fire control officer, Lieutenant Ray Thompson, got message orders, report to Admiral Lee for his staff. And Lee was in his flag quarters, and Thompson went up there and said, well, sir, I've got orders to join you. And Lee said, well, you're the first member of my staff, do whatever a staff's supposed to do. So they pulled out the charts and figured out how to get to Tonga Taboo. Eventually, he got a second staff member to handle the paperwork. One story on the paperwork, a guy named Noble Harris said a message came in from Pacific Fleet, Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. You will provide so-and-so information in 24 hours. Lee, and he's all hot to answer the question. And Lee said, well, just set that aside. We'll think about that for a little while. That was one of his favorite phrases. We'll think about that for a little while. Then they got another message. You have not answered my request. About 4 days after that came another message. Disregard my original message. So Lee had taken just the right approach. Probably somebody in Hawaii was trying to make points with the Admiral with an unnecessary message. But by the end of the war, it was huge. I guess he had about 24 or so staff members, and the South Dakota was configured as a force flagship, so had more quarters to accommodate staff people. And his aide, Gil Ertzen, had a stateroom that was near the uptakes from the boilers. And he said the deck was hot, physically hot. Well, Lee had developed, sent teams out to learn about photography from Disney Studio. So they had people come out and do photo interpretation and triangulation. And they would make rubber maps, topographical maps of the islands they were hitting. Or in this case, Ertzen said he cabbaged onto the topographical map for the island of Palau, put that on the deck, and that kept his feet from being hot. They had the incident I didn't mention, this is in the spring of '45. South Dakota was alongside an ammunition ship, Wrangell, and they had just gotten to the place that they could send ammunition from one ship to another at sea. They've been doing that habitually with oil and food and so forth, but ammunition was new. And they brought some 16-inch powder over, and it was reduced charges, but they hadn't put in spacers to account for the fact that the powder bags were smaller than the cans they were stored in. And of all things, there was ether in the cans as a preservative. And apparently, as they were moving it over a door sill, the bags slid, created an electrical charge. The can exploded. Some men died, some died later of wounds. They had to throw a whole bunch of ammunition overboard because it had been in the next compartment from all that heat. Well, Lee was in his flag plot at the time of the incident. And you've heard of Peter Moss, the author who wrote the book Serpico. Well, he wrote a biography of the man who was the skipper of South Dakota at that time, Captain Swede Momsen. And in his account, he said Momsen was just utterly calm, went to the Admiral, who was hysterical, jumping up and down, saying, "What's going to happen? What's going to happen?" And Momsen said, "Well, we'll know in about 30 seconds if we go skyward." Well, Peter Moss was not on board the South Dakota that day. I interviewed a man who was, Gil Ertzen, and he said Lee was in a comfortable sofa in the flag plot. The captain said people could go aft if they wanted to avoid a possible turret explosion. Lee said, "Well, I'm just going to stay here because I'm comfortable, and if it blows, it won't make any difference anyway." So it didn't blow, and Lee stayed comfortable. But this is how myths get started.
Good question. How much of his legacy or ideas carried on after the surprising death of the massive heart attack?
Well, the experimental task force had been set up specifically to deal with the kamikaze threat. And with the end of the war, the threat went away. There was no more mission. But the command stayed in service. And from that day till this, it still exists. It's now a test and evaluation force, and it tests all the new Navy systems. So that's part of his legacy, to try things out in practical action to see more than what you can learn from the drawing board.
Right, absolutely.
And a number of the men who served with him went on to high positions in the Navy. One of them became Chief of Naval Operations. A number of them became Vice Admirals. Several of them coincidentally commanded the battleship Iowa, including Captain Jennings, who was his sea lawyer and paperwork expert.
Does he treat his men the same way he did? You know what I mean?
Pardon me?
Does that gentleman you just talked about treat his crew the same as Lee did? Did that carry over with his command?
Well, Lee didn't have as much contact with the crew of the flagships as he had when he was commanding his own ship, because he was in the flag quarters. But I heard from several people who had interaction with him on board Washington. And one of them was a man who was about 5'6", was an electrician's mate. Part of his duty was to go around the ship and check that all the lights were working. Well, he went into Lee's cabin one time when one of the lights overhead was burned out. And he said, "Admiral, I'll come back sometime when you're not busy and change that light for you." Lee said, "No, that's not necessary. Hand me the bulb." And Lee, who was taller, screwed in the light bulb. And this electrician's mate said he was probably delighted to have something physical to do with his hands. Gambling is prohibited on board Navy ships. Some people said that they'd have a game up on the bridge, which seems unlikely. I mean, usually you get clandestine places to shoot dice, play cards. And Lee would go through and he would carefully step over the money and the cards and so forth, and "Okay, have a good day, guys," or whatever he said. He was very forgiving. When Captain Gatch, the skipper of the South Dakota, ran aground at Tonga Taboo, there was an investigation. I mean, because if you run your ship aground, that's like a capital offense. And I talked to Captain Thompson, who was his first staff member. He asked Lee on occasion, well, whatever happened to that investigation on Captain Gatch? He said, well, I've got it in my drawer. I'm just going to think about that a little more. And later, somebody else asked him the same question. I'm thinking about it. Finally, the question came, and he said, well, Gatch is ashore now. He's been promoted to Rear Admiral. This can't hurt his career, so now I'll send it in. It says a lot about his personality and why people held him in such high esteem. And there was always that little impish mischief in him that went back to Kentucky.
It was a long way.
And the gunnery was just constant, of shooting the small arms. And he was a real nut on making sure that the 16-inch guns could fire a very tight pattern. They had offset shooting in which the firing ship would shoot a certain angle in the stern of the target ship. And somebody who was on board another ship said that the projectiles from the Washington came down right in the wake, all in a tight pattern. And he emphasized that throughout. And then the irony that when he might have had a chance to shoot those guns at Lady Gulf, Halsey denied him the opportunity. We'll never know, but Urtson explained the difference, why he didn't chase the Japanese in the Marianas and why he wanted to in the Philippines. If he had gone west in the Marianas to chase the Japanese, they would have made sure it was a night battle. And he had been in a night battle and he knew what a chaotic thing it was. The other thing was that those ships out to the west did not constitute a threat to the Marianas. On the other hand, at the Philippines, Kurita's ships constituted a very real threat. Lee could have had his battleships lined up, capping the T if it's known. The ships up at the top could fire their entire batteries off to the side. The Japanese ships coming up could fire only their forward turrets. But he didn't get to do it.
They're still talking about today?
Well, I'm talking about it.
In Navy circles, the things that are not publicized.
Well, they're historians, yes.
That's what.
And he said, yes, in the Philippines, they constituted a very real threat. It's one of the great what-ifs of history.
It is.
Anybody else?
Something else from the internet. Does the Navy need another Admiral Lee?
Yes.
Navy could use a lot of admiral leads.
Yes.
Whether they would be able to fit in, it's hard to say.
Probably not.
Well, thanks again to everybody.
If anybody would like to purchase one of Paul's books, I have some copies here. Yeah. Right here, first thing graciously. And on the second one.
For those of you still watching from home, Naval Institute Press is currently running a sale on Battleship Commander and all of their other books, so that it is 50% off and free shipping through the holidays. I already told you they're sold out of Battleship Commander, but you can buy it at this rate, and they will ship it to you probably in January.
So do you think you could do the same for this one? I could. Appreciate it. Oh, here.